A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars, they've been wrong about jobs, they've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show. I'm Matt Wingard, and with me as always is my good friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
So you can find this show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, just to name a few, usually on your favorite app for listening to podcasts. You can hear us at 5 p.m. on the weekends, Saturday and Sunday, on the405media.com. Welcome to the Gab community. If you would like to suggest a topic or ask me a question for this podcast, please don't hesitate to email me at mattmwingard@gmail.com, and that's spelled mattmwingard@gmail.com. So we had a shooting in Las Vegas, and I had suggested last time that this was a very curious shooting because it was a man of wealth and that maybe there was some kind of a mental breakdown. The gentleman Chapman, who famously started all of these mass shootings by doing the bell tower in Texas, they had found a walnut or pecan, I guess, sized tumor in his brain. But the autopsy just came back on the shooter, and his brain was perfectly normal, they said. So that theory is out. It has been interesting to watch the police change the timeline on what happened. They had originally, there was some dispute over how long it took them to get to the door. They had said that the security guard was shot when he came to the door during the shooting. Now they're saying that the security guard was shot before the shooter then turned and began to do the shooting outside. And there was a maintenance man who found the security guard, and they both knew that they had a dangerous man in the room, and yet somehow it still took about 15 minutes, 12 minutes, 15 minutes for the police to get to that room. He's wearing gloves, and yet he commits suicide. That's also strange. Why was he trying to spare his fingerprints if he intended to kill himself? But then he could have been scheduling an escape that he then felt wasn't going to work out, so he had both possibilities on his mind. Just some curious things. It is a curious shooting, and the fact that we cannot now establish that he had some kind of a brain tumor or some kind of a noticeable mental illness that would explain it as an anomaly. He still remains a very strange shooter because of his wealth.
It's got to be rage over something, but who knows what or if it will ever come out.
Yeah, I think an answer will eventually be suggested, but it does look like, as is always the case in the real world, mistakes happen. People don't catch things. It doesn't look like the Mandalay security was as fast acting as I think customers might hope that they would be in an event like this.
So what is it going to mean going forward? Are we going to have electronic surveillance or going through like airport x-ray machines before you can go into your hotel room? Or
I think that's probably a non-starter in Vegas because it's the convention capital of the world, and people are bringing large cases worth of equipment and whatever it is that they're displaying at their booths all year long. The idea of running all that through security, I think, is unlikely. I do think, again, it's interesting that a shooting like this was carried off in such a heavily monitored area. Casinos have cameras everywhere. I'm interested in seeing some of this footage, but that hasn't been released. There should be video footage of everywhere that the shooter went. From the lobby to the elevators to the hallways, there are cameras everywhere. So they should be able to track his movements second by second, everywhere that he went, except for when he was in his actual hotel suite.
I was reading the biographies of some of the people who were killed, and it's just so sad. I mean, it makes you wonder, where are we safe?
Well, in a mass shooting or in a large car accident on the highway or when an airliner goes down, those are random disasters, random tragedies in which people who are only temporarily in the same place, momentarily in the same place, all lose their lives together. And so when you read those bios, inevitably when a plane goes down or a shooting occurs, they do these stories where they do all the bios. What it really is a kind of a cross-section of America when you read these kinds of things, because whether, it's an airline flight to New York that crashes in Iowa, it tends just to be 200 random people from the country. And so it is an interesting look into who we are, because it's a lottery that those few hundred people lost, essentially.
Well, one of the polls that I saw said that 32% of the people polled, and I don't know exactly who those were, said they would be less likely to go to large gathering public events.
Well, I think, though, we have to push past fear and let our rational mind surface again. And there's an irrational fear of flying as well, because when airplanes crash, it's catastrophic. In many cases, planes don't crash right away. They may take a couple of minutes. I know of one particular airline crash in which they were on kind of a roller coaster ride for almost an hour before it eventually crashed in the ocean. Those are horrific stories. We don't like reading them. Every single airline accident gets coverage. And so it's much like child kidnapping. It is reinforced to us, and it stokes this fear. But statistically, it's still an extremely rare occurrence. Flying is still safer than driving. Statistically, you are more likely to be killed in a fatal car accident than you are to be one of the very few people that will die in an airline accident.
But statistically, these shootings are becoming greater all the time.
Well, there's certainly more than there used to be, but if you think of all the public events that people go to versus a very occasional shooting in which, in this case, 500 people are injured. I mean, millions of people go to concerts and outdoor events in the United States all year long. And so, again, the chances that you're going to be shot in a mass shooting are extremely rare. I think to live our lives in a state of fear over highly improbable events like airline crashes or mass shootings or child kidnappings is to move out of a rational world and to diminish your own life, because you're denying yourself experiences and travel and all the rest out of, again, what is a very low statistical probability. So it's not rational. It's also giving yourself over to the media hype that occurs. Again, when it comes to, there are literally only about 150 stranger abductions of children in the United States. This is a country of 330 million people. Children are much more likely to die in the bathtub or in some other event. But again, just as with airline accidents or mass shootings, those will always get covered. Every single one will get covered, and it will get covered for days. And so, again, if we don't allow our rational mind to surface, it can be easy to be pushed into believing that these dangers are right around the corner or ever present, because that's what the media chooses to cover. I'll give you a good example. It would be very easy to live in the Midwest and to travel to Chicago on a regular basis and to be unaware that dozens of people are shot in Chicago every week and that thousands are shot in Chicago every year, because the media doesn't cover every single one of those. And so you could, without much thought, travel to Chicago quite frequently and never feel afraid. Now, imagine if the media, NBC, CBS, all of them, decided to cover every single shooting in Chicago for 10 minutes each. Within a year, people would think of Chicago as this extremely dangerous place, like the Mideast, and they would be afraid to go there, and tourism would plummet. And that is not a difference in what's actually happening in Chicago. It's a difference in how the media chooses to cover what's happening in Chicago. So, we do talk about that with some regularity on this podcast. The media has a great deal of power in what they choose to emphasize and to dwell on. And we talk about their bias and how if it's a Republican scandal or if it's something they want to criticize Trump about, then they're going to spend a week on it. If it's a Democrat who's gotten in trouble, it's a 24-hour story and they move on. And again, over years, that can make you, if you're not thinking, believe that somehow Republicans are more corrupt or that they get in more trouble or what have you, because that's the emphasis that the media chooses to place. Another random example I've noticed since the Weinstein story came out, every day now, I notice a story in which the media is trying to connect Trump to Weinstein. There was a story yesterday about how the prosecutor in New York had had an opportunity to file charges against Weinstein and had not done so. But the story was a picture of Weinstein and the Trump children, and it said, prosecutor has passed on prosecutions of Weinstein and the Trump children in recent years. So they decided to put the two together in a story they knew people would be currently interested in, which is Weinstein. They threw the Trump children in there. Now that is bias 101. Now, is anything in the story not true? No, it's not true. I mean, it's true that those things, there was a possibility of prosecution and it was passed. But lumping them together and having this graphic, they had this kind of greasy picture graphic of Weinstein and the Trump children, and they visually put them together. That's done very purposefully on the part of the media. This morning, I saw a story that said Bannon had once had a business relationship with Weinstein in the 90s. Apparently, he'd had some documentary he was involved in. The Weinstein Company was distributing it, right? So, again, just anything they can do to connect Bannon to Weinstein now that Weinstein is this huge monster in the media, even though this would have been a very minor relationship business-wise in the vast relationships that Weinstein Company had. And the idea that Bannon, therefore, would have had any idea what Weinstein was doing with women that were coming to his hotel is just ludicrous. And hundreds of people have had business relationships, perhaps thousands, with Harvey Weinstein. But who does the Hill, in this case, the Hill newspaper, who do they choose to do a story about? They pick out the one that they want to taint because now, currently Weinstein's the devil. So let's put Bannon with Weinstein in an article and say, he once had a business relationship with him in the 90s.
Well, I guess it could be worse. They could have said he had a non-business relationship with Weinstein.
I suppose, but think of all the money that Weinstein has raised for Democrats. And if the fact that you have any kind of a connection to Weinstein means you get a story in the Hill in which your picture is put next to Weinstein's, then there should already be pictures of Hillary Clinton with Weinstein and pictures of Bill Clinton with Weinstein. And half the elected Democrats nationally should have their picture in the Hill next to Harvey Weinstein with a story about how much money he raised for them in their campaigns. But of course, the Hill has no interest in doing that story. They want to do the story about Bannon. That kind of bias is so frequent now. It's literally as common as water. And when I do my news feed, for those of you who follow my news feed, either on Twitter or on Gab, I completely filter all of that crap out. It is so numerous. You're literally, my standards for the news feed is that it has to be of some relevance, because there's a lot of fluff and crap and clickbait out there, and I filter that out for you. But then also there's a tremendous amount of narrative pushing and Overton window framing and, trying to get, for instance, this story, which I would never pass on in my newsfeed, connecting Bannon to Weinstein, because it's a non-story. It's simply a choice, an editorial choice that the paper and the leftists at the paper at the Hill have made to try to take a shot at Bannon. And it has absolutely no relevance to anything. Now, if they were doing an expose on everyone that had a business with Harvey Weinstein, and they had pictures of all of them, Clinton and Obama, and they had Bannon in there because he also had a business relationship, well, fine, I'd pass that story along because I can tell when something is fair and not. But there are so many stories like that are clearly just leftists in the newsroom sitting around thinking about what shot they can take at the Trumps today. I see those every day, and I simply just cut them out. I don't even bother passing them along. So if you're following my feed, you're getting a much more rational view of the world. But of course, I need to remind myself, and I try to remind all of you, that lots of sheeple out there are watching those news feeds every day. And so they're being fed that garbage on a constant basis. And you just have to be aware of that, which is part of what's creating a lot of the difference in our politics and the tension, because if you're one of these people sitting there absorbing CNN and MSNBC all day long, you're just being filled with all of this rage that Trump is a Nazi and that World War III is right around the corner. You can imagine how just, it would be like, it's the equivalent of watching stories all day long on airplane accidents, mass shootings, and child kidnappings. You'd be afraid to leave your house. And what those channels are doing is that same thing on Republicans and Trump and his children and Steve Bannon. They're constantly filling their viewers' heads with these extreme notions about them. And you can only imagine the effect that that's having on the sheeple who are absorbing it all day long.
You have to give creativity awards to the media to be making so many long paragraphs about Donald Trump throwing a roll of paper towels. I still don't get it. It's so ridiculous.
Yeah, so Doris and I know someone who was all a Twitter about that particular event. Now, what actually happened was he was in a room in Puerto Rico where a bunch of locals, Puerto Ricans, were gathered to see him. It was also a staging area for handing out supplies. And they had a barricade and everything so that the Secret Service can protect him and so that he isn't crushed. But people were sort of trying to mob him. They wanted a picture with him and they wanted to touch him. And they're trying to do a photo op where they essentially hand out the goods to recipients, something that every single president does. And everybody wanted to get something. At that point, they'd handed him paper towels to hand out. And everybody wanted something from the president. They wanted to receive, whether it would have been a bag of sugar or a roll of paper towels, it didn't matter. People wanted the president to see them, to recognize them, to make eye contact with them, to give them. So he was handing it to people who were right in front of him, and people further back in the crowd were saying, here, 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 because they wanted some attention from the president. So he began jovially lofting paper towels, rolls of paper towels, to the people that were further back so that they could receive something from him as well, which is what they were calling for. And this was all done in fun and good spirit, and everybody there was happy, and the president stayed for a long time, and practically everyone got a chance to shake his hand and take his picture with him. It's a total non-event as far as anything to criticize. If Obama had done that, no one would have said a thing.
Can you imagine Obama doing that? I cannot. He's just too much of a stuffed shirt, but it wasn't probably presidential looking.
I don't know. I think it seemed to me like an entirely normal thing. If you actually watched it unfold for 10 or 20 minutes, it seemed perfectly normal. But of course, the press is looking every day to pull something he said out of context or to try to, because he doesn't talk in very rehearsed political speak, which is one of the reasons why a lot of people like me love him, because he's real. But when you get somebody that's real, that means they're speaking off the cuff, and everything they say is not perfectly phrased. And so therefore, it's very easy just to grab a sentence and say, what a dummy. You know, because his grammar wasn't right, or his sentence didn't entirely make sense. That's how normal people talk. If you listen to my podcast, we're now on our 20th hour, I'm sure there's a sentence I've said that wasn't grammatically correct. And imagine somebody just pulling that out and saying, oh, low IQ, he's a dummy. It's so easy to do, and it's so irresponsible for reporters. So, you know, they see him doing this, and immediately what goes out is pictures of him tossing the paper towel with headlines of, you know, Trump throws paper towels to victims of Hurricane Irma. It's so false. It's so phony. It's important, I think, in this discussion, to wrap it up, to understand, and believe me when I tell you, that there are people in every major newsroom, the New York headquarters for NBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they have a morning story meeting every morning where they decide what the news of the day is, and assignments are given on things like hurricanes and Vegas shootings and who's going to cover that stuff. But there are usually extra people around, and there are filler stories. There's usually things that just have to kind of be discussed of what besides the major events that have to be covered, what are the other things we're going to do today? And that discussion usually goes on for about 20 minutes, assignments are made, and then everybody works all day to get it done. I am guaranteeing you that every day, either in the full meeting or as an aside, a handful of people to get together and ask themselves, what screw Donald Trump story can we do today?
I believe that.
And they think about what negative slant they can make. For instance, that Harvey Weinstein Bannon story was a result of a morning meeting at the Hill in which somebody said, probably the editor took a reporter aside and said, I bet Steve Bannon has, because he was in the film industry, I bet he has some connection to Harvey Weinstein. I want you to look into that. And if there is a connection, I want you to do a story just on that connection today. And bingo, some reporter dutifully goes off, pulls some records, sees that there was a business relationship in the 90s, and you get a full 250, 300-word story in The Hill about that one connection out of hundreds, because they dislike Bannon, and Harvey Weinstein is now basically the Hitler of the week, and they want to connect him to him. So Catalan, we talked about the Catalan independence, and what happened on Monday was that the leader of the Catalonian state, he's in a bind. I've told you before that there's some minority, maybe 40% of Catalonians, that I'm just making up numbers now, but it's somewhere in less than 50% is my guess, of Catalonians who do not want independence. But among that 50 to 65% of Catalonians that do want independence, there's a certain portion of them that don't really want independence. They want a better relationship. They want a better financial deal and more local autonomy with Madrid. And so they want to use independence as a vehicle to get that. And then within that, there are people who actually just want real, actual independence. And what happened on Monday was the Catalonian leader was in a bind because there's a portion of his independence coalition that doesn't want him to announce actual independence. And Madrid has stationed the military at key locations right on the outside, ready to go and to storm. There's threats that they will be arrested, the leadership of Catalonia. So what he does is he gives this speech in which he declares their independence and then immediately suspends it so that negotiations can continue with Madrid, which was such a weasel move. And he was ridiculed. Wikipedia put Catalonia on the list of countries whose independence was the shortest lived, and they put his at 8 seconds. The Catalonian state existed for 8 seconds, which was how long it took him to declare an independence before he then declared that it was suspended. The reason why I think it's a complete fail is because those who are hesitant in the independence movement somehow think that this brinksmanship is going to get Madrid to negotiate with them. But Madrid very obviously sees the weakness in the coalition that they're facing, and they have made it very clear they will not negotiate. So there's nothing that's going to happen while this is suspended. And now Madrid is calling their bluff and announced that they would give them 8 days to clarify that statement and to make it clear that Catalonia is not an independent state.
Well, the 8 days relates to the 8 seconds, right?
That's clever. That's clever. So we're headed for that 8-day window. It'll be sometime next week, in which, again, though, I think this is a chance for Catalonia to turn around on Madrid, because what if he just doesn't clarify? Right? So now Madrid is asking Catalonia to make a statement that they are not independent. And if I were the leader of Catalonia, I would just ignore the deadline. If you're going to storm us and make arrests, storm us. Whether you do that 8 days from now or 18 days from now doesn't matter. But if you don't make a clarifying statement, then this stalemate continues. Again, I think they hope that Madrid's going to negotiate with them. I don't think Madrid is. I think the only way forward when you're this far off and down the plank is to declare independence. But I don't know whether they have the guts to do it. And they may have missed their window, because with the violence that Madrid perpetrated, I think that the sentiment for independence had spiked in Catalonia. And there's this interesting picture online of the crowds waiting for the declaration of independence, and they're all cheering for 8 seconds while he's declaring it, and then when he suspends it, they all have this dejected look, and there's this photo of the same place in the crowd side by side with this woman all excited and then dejected. And I think he's taken a little bit of the fire and the heat out of this movement by appearing to not be strong. It's a real signal of weakness that the Catalonian leadership has put out there. And when you're doing something as dangerous and as bold as declaring independence, especially with Madrid stationing the military nearby, to signal weakness like that, I think, is to invite the sheeple within your own group, and every group has sheeple, to stampede away from you. When you looked strong and you had momentum and you had the higher ground because they were perpetrating violence against you, some of those sheeple come your direction and they're on your side. And then when you look like you're waffling and that you're not really confident in your Declaration of Independence, and Madrid looks steadfast and strong and is putting tanks and everything on the outside of town, I think you have a lot of people in the middle, those sheeple, who move away from you and figure, well, this isn't going to work out. You people aren't going to win in the end. So I'm going to go home and hide in my closet.
More politics than passion, apparently.
So I was listening to something that Rush Limbaugh was saying about Hollywood, and it sparked a point that I want to make. He was arguing that there's a certain level of phoniness in Hollywood among some of these men because he suggested that it's not that their politics aren't liberal, but there are a lot of people who sort of wear the mask of liberalism because it's cover for them to do all sorts of terrible things, and as long as they're on the side of the angels, they get a lot of forgiveness. Point being, for instance, the way the left reacted to Bill Clinton, who did the exact same kinds of things that Harvey Weinstein is accused of, and yet they defended him because he had power, he was president of the United States, they wanted him to be able to oppose any kind of abortion legislation, and so for political reasons they were willing to excuse bad behavior because they felt that they needed him. And his point was that he believed there was a certain level of phoniness in Hollywood, and people who virtue signal and donate and do a lot of work for the Democrats basically as insulation or as a get-out-of-jail-free card for them when the day comes that their own bad behavior is exposed. Because if you're a Republican and you do something like Harvey Weinstein, you're completely, although it looks like he is going to be destroyed, but in general, on a typical day when bad behavior comes out, if it's a Republican, they're decimated. And if it's a Democrat, sometimes they're decimated, sometimes they just need to take a leave of absence from the stage for a few years, and they can come back. Anthony Weiner's a good example. If he hadn't had continuing problems, he was staging a comeback and running for mayor of New York after he'd had to resign as a congressman and gone away for a couple of years. And if it hadn't come out that he was still basically in contact with women and still cheating on his wife during that mayoral's race, he might have won that. So there is redemption there for people who have these get-out-of-jail-free cards always on the left. And so Rush Limbaugh was making this point about there's a certain level of phoniness in the politics in Hollywood. And the thought that I had that it's delicate, so I'm going to launch right into it. We're not afraid on this podcast. But I have thought for some time that when you see straight white males within the left movement, that you're dealing with men, I believe, who have a selfish motive. There's a lot of free love available on the left, and I think there are a lot of straight white males who are virtue signaling within that movement because it's kind of a free fire zone for unmarried sex and all of that for them. And what I mean by that is, if you look at this coalition of the fringes that makes up the left, whether it's gays or minorities or women, it's motivated by an anger and a hostility towards societal norms and all the rest. And even if you disagree, you can understand the sort of groupthink that's going on and what's motivating people to band together and to essentially fight for special privileges. But the locus, the focus of all of that hatred from all of those groups is straight white men. So it begs the question, why would there be any straight white men in that movement if they are the devil that all of this hatred is focused on? And for the most part, straight white men have abandoned the left, and they've moved away from it and joined the vast anti-left coalition, because who wants to be the focus of all evil and to be thought of as the source of all problems in the world? But still, and you've seen it with Antifa and some of this other stuff, it does appear as if there are certain number of straight white males who exist within that coalition. And I have felt for some time that those are sort of the worst of the straight white males, because what they are essentially, self-criticizing and saying, yes, we're the problem, absolutely, because this is what the coalition that they're hanging out with wants to hear, and it makes them a good guy. It makes them attractive. And if you are trolling for women, if you're looking to have kind of a wide open sex life in which you want to be with women, basically a free love lifestyle, and women on the left tend to believe in that kind of lifestyle, then telling people what they want to hear and reflecting back on them that everything they believe is true is a great way to talk women into bed. And so I am convinced that there is a large number of straight white males. Again, they make up a tiny proportion because most straight white males are not in the left. But of those that are in there, I think there are a lot who basically it's a giant dating pool for them. Now, the other thing to sort of realize about that is that the men who would do that are probably not the most stellar human beings in the world. And so it is no surprise to me that the left has found that the men among them are pretty bad actors, like Harvey Weinstein. I think that the men in this group are mostly badly behaved because by their very nature, they're opportunistic and they're grifters, which is why they're in an organization that purports to hate them. They're going around telling everyone, yeah, it's right, straight white males like me, we're the worst. Because why would somebody do that if there wasn't something they were getting out of that? And while everyone else in the coalition of the fringes is getting a reinforcement that their group is somehow a victim and that, yeah, we're going to beat the man, the people who represent the man in that group obviously must be getting something else out of it. And I think what it is this sort of access to free love, if you will. And they're bad actors, to use a terrible pun in relation to talking about Hollywood.
I don't know. You know what you've just done is all those displaced, non-affiliated with any political group. You've just sent all those men to be liberals since that's where the action is.
Well, again, you're talking about more badly behaved men moving into the left. And I think it explains some of the anger that you see from politically active feminists. Some of them are lesbians, but of the ones that are straight, imagine if you're an active, angry feminist on the left. And so then throughout high school and college and afterwards, the men you're dating and hanging out with are straight white men of the left who are these grifters and opportunistic guys, then your experiences with men must be just awful. And so that would make you even angrier. And I think, you see it with, for instance, with, say, Ashley Judd, who had this experience with Harvey Weinstein, unbeknownst to all of us. And yet when Trump is elected, she's wearing the pussy hat and at the march in D.C., coming completely unglued and looking crazed. And it makes no sense unless you stop and think that she's had to run the gauntlet in a Hollywood of handsy men who have treated her badly, but they're all good liberals. And so, of course, she's not hanging out with men from country music, although she should be because her mother and sister are from that world. But I mean, she's not hanging out with conservative men because she hates conservative men because of their politics. But they would have treated her a heck of a lot better than the men she's hanging out with in Hollywood. So I think there is something to this, that some of what's fueling this anger in these women on the left is that the only men they're hanging out with and having relationships with are men of the left who are, to some degree or another, kind of in it for the free love. So I wanted to update on the NFL. This is interesting. The initial reaction to Trump saying that people should stand for the anthem was basically to say, screw you, and that he doubled and tripled down and did a bunch of kneeling, and the ratings have tanked for the NFL. So now in the last few days, the NFL commissioner has suggested that maybe there should be a rule that everyone should stand for the national anthem, which is just hysterical. They're absolutely caving on this. And much like with the Harvey Weinstein scandal, there's a lot of circular firing squads going on. Ben Affleck is being dragged into the Harvey Weinstein thing because of certain women claiming in Twitter accounts that he's touched them inappropriately. But there was a black ESPN contributor who called for an advertiser boycott because Jerry Jones had said that any player who didn't stand for the anthem wouldn't play for his team. And immediately ESPN suspended that commentator for a period of time. Didn't fire, but did suspend. And that caused the Black Lives Matter folks to get hysterical and to turn their ire on ESPN. So it's all about the money. I mean, ESPN is perfectly fine with all of this politics and the hits that it's taking to their brand. But the moment one of their own called for a boycott of advertisers, that freaked ESPN out. That you can't have. But it caused them to essentially put themselves on the opposite side of the BLM hysterics. And so they ran a mob, and suddenly they found themselves besieged by the mob. And if you follow me at all politically, you know that I think the most evil thing in the world is a mob. I think throughout history, mobs have been the personification of evil on this planet. It's when humans are at their worst, they lose their individuality, they do horrific things. And I think that the most evil thing that you can do, perhaps besides child murder, is to participate in a mob. And I have tremendous sympathy for people who are victims of mobs, whether they are physical mobs or whether they are social media mobs that occur. However, I do make one exception because I do think that you have to make room for cosmic justice. People who have participated in mobs, either physically or online, and then at some point in their life find themselves the victim of a physical or social media mob, I believe are receiving cosmic justice. And that is the one time when somebody is a victim of a mob in which my sympathy is not that great. Because if you've done something like that, if you've participated in shredding somebody or murdering somebody, either physically or spiritually by participating in some mob that unpersons a human being for something that they said, then when the day comes where that happens to you, that's justice. That's just justice. And so watching CNN feed a mob for a couple of years and now suddenly find themselves the focus of that mob that they helped to create in Black Lives Matter, I don't have a lick of sympathy for ESPN. That is cosmic justice. But I do want to make one more point about this whole NFL issue and people turning it off. It's clear that without fantasy football, the NFL would be in real trouble. I think a lot of people who are watching the NFL aren't even that interested in specific teams, but they've gotten very interested in fantasy football, and that has brought them into watching NFL games on a regular basis. So that was a financial coup 10 or 15 years ago when that really took off for the NFL that they should be eternally grateful for. But I think the larger point to make is that, and this is not just the case with professional football, it's true of professional sports in general and a lot of the television, movies, everything that we consume. There is a steady diet of bread and circuses that are fed to the American people. Any large empire, any big, powerful society throughout human history has had some element of bread and circuses in which the government either supports or fosters in some way this distraction, this level of entertainment for the great unwashed masses in their society that they pull their troops from when they need to go to war, and that they expect to do all of the kind of manufacturing and grow agriculture and all the rest. The workers who toil are given and encouraged to participate in, and it's sometimes it develops organically, but in some way, ultimately, the government always ends up subsidizing it to keep it going, even if it does develop organically at first. And those bread and circuses serve a purpose. They sort of act as a counterbalance against revolution in society because they keep people, to use a phrase, fat and happy and distracted and entertained during their off time when they're not working. And again, it's not necessarily a plot. Like I said, many of these things, even in Roman times, things like the Colosseum and gladiator games, those things developed organically, originally. But once the government sees that they are a very useful thing in society, they won't let them collapse for lack of money or funds. They will, when they get in trouble, step in and subsidize them to make sure that they continue, because they see them as a very useful part of society, keeping people entertained and distracted when they're not doing their work during their off hours. We have to be aware of that. And if we're in this war against the elites, and we're trying to save this country and its basic principles, we have to fight an assumption that our elites make about us, which is at the end of the day, we will succumb to the bread and circuses, that we are addicted to that crack cocaine, essentially, that is fed to us, and that even if we get angry about something temporarily, we will revert eventually back to the mean and go back to being fat and happy with our bread and circuses. Now, I say all of that to make a point about the NFL. The folks who run the NFL are making a gamble right now behind closed doors, I guarantee you, that this too shall pass. That if they just wait long enough, make a few corrections, do some virtue signaling, that we will go back to watching the NFL and let bygones be bygones. Now, that may be true. And there may be some of you out there who just need your NFL fix so badly that you cannot give it up. Okay. But that's how we lose. When they challenge us so openly, when the president says you should stand for the national anthem and their response is to triple down, and the owners come out, even Jerry Jones of the Dallas Cowboys comes out and kneels with his players to essentially say, screw you. You will not roll this back. This whole liberal fixing of America is just going to continue forward. If we are not willing en masse to punish them to the point where they cry uncle and give us what we want, then they're going to win. And we've talked about this in the podcast about our desire to go back to calm and to want peace. And so we are usually the first ones to blink, and they're counting on that. So if you can't find a way to reorganize your life so that you find something else that's entertaining to do that doesn't include NFL, because I think the NFL needs to be made an example of, and frankly, we'll get to keep, I'll make an even larger argument, we'll get to keep most of our bread and circuses if we're willing to make a few sacrifices. Because if you don't think the NBA and Major League Baseball and all the others aren't watching what's happening right now, you're kidding yourself. And they're going to draw one of two lessons, which is either that the fans were able to so cripple the NFL that we will never cross them again, and you'll get really good behavior from all of the other sports, or they're going to see the NFL win out the day in the ensuing months, and they're going to see the fans trickle back, and they're going to say, oh, so we can continue to push our liberal aims, and we just have to experience a little pushback for a few weeks or months, but then they'll eventually get tired, and they'll go back to wanting their gladiatorial games and their free bread, and we'll get our way. And Hollywood is watching, the video game industry is watching, everything out there that makes up the vast array of bread and circuses, all of the elites who own and control those things, they're watching this power struggle between us and the NFL right now. And they're going to draw a conclusion about how loyal we are to Trump and the kinds of nationalist things that he's advocating for. They're watching. So everyone out there listening to me, as an individual, your decision matters. Just like no one of us elected Trump, but all of us together deciding to vote for Trump got him elected. Well, no one of us are going to punish the NFL and cause a change in elite behavior. But if we all stick together, we will get what we want. Going back to DACA, and I know there were concerns out there the president was giving away the store on DACA and that all of these young adults, 22 to 36, were going to be given citizenship. But I had suggested that the president was probably going to put together a list of asks in return, and that came out this week. And so what they asked for was the wall funding, a ban on sanctuary cities, requirement of E-Verify, and a change in our immigration system to a merit-based, point-based immigration system, and an end to chain migration. Well, that's, they're immediately within days, there were all these villainous stories about how Stephen Miller is still at the White House and he's responsible for this. And the Democrats have balked and said that's poison pill. Clearly, the president doesn't want a deal. So the president has positioned himself perfectly as asking for the things that 70% of Americans want. The Democrats have said, no, we just want illegals to be given citizenship. And they are now the party of illegal aliens, gun control, and protesting the American flag. Good luck in 2018, Democrats. I don't think a DACA deal is going to be reached. Certainly, the president's initial offering might have been an art of the deal, and he may be willing to settle for slightly less than that list. But I doubt that Democrats can get on board for anything on that list. And so if the president is asked for, 5, 6 things and is willing to accept 3, he still made it impossible, because I don't think the Democrats will give him even half of those things. So I do not at this point believe that a deal can be reached on DACA, because the Democrats don't really want to fix the immigration system, as has always been the case. They just want to continue on with open borders and with legalizing immigrants that are flooding in so that they get more votes. So I think there's reason to hope that there isn't going to be any deal on DACA, and when they reach the 6-month expiration on the president's temporary restraint, that they'll just be lumped in with everyone else for deportation. I think the Democrats don't, they've been threatening to shut down the government over this, which I think is just, the Republicans are too stupid to take them up on that offer. And there are too many Republicans that are not working for us. But if we had an actual opposition party that was on our side, they would try to maneuver the Democrats to do just that, to shut down the government because we're not giving citizenship to illegal aliens. It's such a terrible position for the Democrats to be in, for somebody to not be getting their check and for national parks to be closed and for all sorts of consequences to be happening because of a government shutdown, because the Democrats want a couple million illegal aliens to be made citizens of the United States. It's such a winning political position. But of course, the Republicans who are hoaxing us and are worthless, they're not going to grab a hold of that. They're too stupid. Speaking of gun control, why do liberals support gun control? I do think it's worth making this point. Obviously, there are political differences, and I do think you genuinely have a kind of a leftist viewpoint out there, a communist-leaning viewpoint that only the government should have the means of force. And you have a lot of liberals who've never come into contact with guns. They have no history of it. They weren't introduced to guns as children, either through hunting or target shooting or what have you. And so there's definitely a strong political element of it. But I also think there's a lifestyle difference. And we've talked about the cloud cities in the United States and the fact that liberals are sort of huddling in these urban centers in the United States, in which they live in a society in which they have no idea how anything functions. All of the electricity and transportation and food and everything is supplied by very complex systems that usually Republicans are running. And in some cases, it's even based outside of the city, and the material or the electricity or whatever is pumped in. And so they live in these sort of cloud cities where they don't understand how anything works, but it's still a rarefied life. It's a nice life. There are great restaurants with every cuisine within walking distance, and all the lights turn on immediately when you need them, and you have access to your gaming console and a big screen TV. And you don't have to understand even where this stuff is all manufactured, which is usually overseas by children and partial slave labor in Asia and the rest. You don't have to understand any of that. You just enjoy this rarefied lifestyle. And guns seem like an unnecessary insertion of violence into this urban cloud city lifestyle. And the fact that I think there's some level of subconscious bigotry in there as well, because whites who live in these cities are living in fairly close proximity to pockets of their city that have minority enclaves, in which there tends to be a lot of gun violence. And so their association with guns is basically they're in the hands of these poor minorities who are killing themselves and occasionally us when they're robbing us or carjacking or what have you. So they just associate guns in this sort of fearful way. And that creates this split in the feelings about gun control. Whereas people outside of these cities tend to be more Republican, more self-sufficient. Guns are seen as more utilitarian. When you live out in rural areas where the response time from the police might be many minutes, you want to be able to defend yourself if you're dealing with a home invader or any other problem. Also, people who are outside these cloud cities are much more connected to reality. They tend to be much more focused on their constitutional rights, and they don't necessarily see that government, which uses them in some way or another as labor to make these cloud cities work and function. They see themselves as more tools and not necessarily the beneficiaries, at the top end of this society. So government isn't this wonderful angel doing great things. Matter of fact, if you live out in the rural areas, government can seem extremely oppressive. So the idea proposed by our founding fathers that the reason why the citizenry should be as well armed as the government is because they may one day need to overthrow that government, that has a ring of truth for people who live out in rural areas and see the BLM and the Forest Service and ATF and all these others as oppressive agencies and not necessarily there to do kind things. They're much more interested in control. And so people who live under that control and balk against it want to be armed. And they believe in this idea that they should be armed in case there's ever a need to overthrow the government. People who live in cloud cities have given up basic ideas of freedom. And they have forgotten the kinds of things that the Boy Scouts teach about self-sufficiency, because they want to live these rarefied lives, and they know, consciously or unconsciously, they have given themselves over to the government to supply all of this. And so the idea that they would ever revolt against that government, it makes absolutely no sense, because they're entirely dependent on it.
The word serf comes to mind.
In some ways, although in a society of serfs, there are aristocrats who live on top of that. And I do think, because a lot of our serfs are mechanical in some way or another now in society, and as robots come online, that may be even more true. But a lot of these people, even people who are not necessarily wealthy, live rarefied lives. I mean, even if you make a very modest income, if you live in an urban area, based on what you have access to and the quality of your food and your water and the entertainment that's available to you, you still live a very rarefied life on this planet. And that is all supplied by systems that you don't understand and that the government heavily controls. So there's absolutely no interest in overthrowing the government, because the government is this giant game console, if you will, some distant entity on the other side of the internet that is supplying all these good and wonderful things, including all that bread and circuses. So I do want to talk for a few minutes about the PBS series Vietnam. I had brought it up before when I was about halfway through, and I have now finished that series, and I want to give a final review on it. I'm going to give it a B+, and I'm going to make some of the same points I made before, but with a little bit more detail. Let's start with what works. The interviews that they have chosen, and they have found veterans from both sides of the conflict. Frankly, not just the North Vietnamese, but the Viet Cong, who were fighting a guerrilla insurgency in the South, and then South Vietnamese ARVN troops, and then U.S. troops. So there are basically 4 entities in this war, and they have interviews from veterans from all sides, and these are really exceptionally well done interviews, and the producers should be congratulated for finding all of these people and getting them to talk and to tell stories that are immensely interesting and revealing. The editing, the music, and the story flow are all first rate. This story and the basic overview of mechanically how the war unfolded is done exceptionally well. It is extremely well produced. And the reason I'm giving it a B+, and why I am recommending the show, is because as a tutorial of what actually happened month by month, essentially, it's extremely well done and informative. And of course, this far beyond the war, there's a lot of information we now know that we didn't know at the time that they can insert in there. You do need to be aware of that as you watch it. Be paying very careful attention to when they point out that this was not information that people, either Americans or others, knew at the time. Because that you need to have that information to understand why people are reacting the way they are. They did not have the information you're getting at that moment, and they wouldn't necessarily get it till the war was long over. So you can't be too harsh on people's support for the war or support for certain elements of what's going on if you fully understand that they did not have all of the information that we now have. And that's true. That would be true in World War II or any war. People at the time have to make decisions based on what they know, and you may very well learn things years later that you didn't know, and that's just common. I think what's pointed out is the constant deception that's occurring at the top. I think everyone's involved in that, but probably the worst actor is LBJ. The things that he's saying in private and the conversations that are going on between him and Robert McNamara versus what he's telling the American people. And they do a really good job of playing you a tape of some of the things that he's admitting to Robert McNamara. Literally on the same day or the day before, they then show you a clip of a televised speech he gave to the American people in which he says the exact opposite. So that was revealing and interesting. I think there's certainly a slightly left perspective to the overall documentary, and I'll get to that in a minute, but to the extent that there's a slight left lean, the doubts that are expressed at the highest levels because they recorded themselves, and frankly we wouldn't know if they didn't, it's sickening. And the fact that many of them knew it was unwinnable and continued to escalate the troop levels is depressing in the extreme. Now, one thing that is not pointed out as well in the documentary, and we're going to get to some of its flaws now, is that when you're watching Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson and even eventually Nixon, at that point I think they really knew that he had promised the American people he would withdraw us from the war, so he had a slightly different perspective. But it's important to keep in mind that none of them believed that a total victory was possible. They were never, for instance, they were never like delusional in thinking that they were going to win a conventional victory over the North Vietnamese forces, raise the American flag in Hanoi, and have victory. So you cannot watch the decisions they're making and somehow say, oh, well, why would they do this if they knew they couldn't win? The only way to understand the decisions that are made in Vietnam is to remember that old axiom that people are always fighting the last war. Generals are always fighting the last war. And the politicians who got us involved in Vietnam were using the Korean template. And what had happened in Korea was that the North had invaded the South. We had pushed them back. The Chinese got involved and pushed us back. And then ultimately, we all decided to cease fire and reestablish that line in the middle of the country. And by the time Vietnam occurred, there had been a ceasefire in Korea for nearly 15 years. And there still is, essentially, no end to that war, just a ceasefire in Korea in which the country is redivided along the line in the middle. Basically a status quo of what it had been before the conflict started. All of our leaders thought that same result was achievable in Vietnam, that the North Vietnamese had pushed the French out, and they had North Vietnam, and they were undermining and invading and trying to take over South Vietnam, and they believed that if we got involved, we could make things as violent and as deadly as possible for the North Vietnamese, that they would eventually capitulate and agree to reestablish that boundary between the two countries. So the goal was not to defeat the North Vietnamese. They didn't even believe that was possible. The goal was to reestablish that line. Now, that still doesn't excuse a lot of the decisions that were made, but it certainly helps it make a little bit more sense. Unfortunately, and as you watch the documentary, it's clear, the North Vietnamese were not the Koreans, and they had also watched that war and taken lessons from it. And they were not going to allow that same end result to occur. They were more determined to unify the country. So that was important to know. I do think that the demonstrations and the pushbacks, the so-called peace marches, are the part where the documentary falls down. They continue to, with just one segment that talks about the weathermen and some violent activity that took place, and that's just done once and then they move on. They don't really give a full presentation of the strong anti-American sentiments that existed within the anti-war movement. And you can see it visually when you see the North Vietnamese flags being flown, but they never even really address that. Not once does the documentary, well, there may have been one veteran who points out that they were carrying North Vietnamese flags, so I think it gets mentioned once. But they essentially are dismissive of the idea that it's anything other than a genuine peace process. And when they get to the Kent State shooting, there's this, again, this sort of a bias that these kids are just shot in cold blood. What is missing from that is there is a purposeful desire to escalate and to create confrontations among the marchers. They throw things at the police. They charge the barricades. They attempt to create a physical confrontation, both at the Democratic Convention, even in places like Kent State and in other college campuses. If the peace process had always actually been peaceful, if they had marched with permits, even in large numbers, and done their routes and sang their songs, there would never have been a Kent State shooting. There would never have been any violence at all, and probably their same results would have been achieved. There was violence and provocation because the people marching, not all of them, but there were elements within them that wanted that provocation. They believed that the peace movement wasn't achieving its aims, and they wanted to escalate things to try to draw attention. Now, that's a purposeful strategy, and it doesn't get pointed out in the documentary very well, and it leaves the viewer with this idea of sort of one-sided violence, which is unfair to the people on the pro-America or pro-war or supportive of the administration side, or the pro-soldier side, because it's sort of left out. What's kind of left out is the purposeful provocations that occur at these marches. And I think that needed to be addressed. And also, there's almost no interviews or clips from these marches given where you would get a sense of the strong anti-American sentiment that existed among a lot of the young people who participated in these marches. And I think, again, to understand that, is to understand the counter-reaction that occurred within the American population against those marches. If they had just been pacifist marches against the war, I think you wouldn't have gotten as strong a counter-reaction from patriotic Americans. And so by leaving out the kinds of things that Americans at the time saw and heard, which was strong anti-American sentiments, North Vietnamese flags, rocks, bricks, bottles being thrown, people saw and experienced that, and that created a strong counter-reaction that these dirty hippies, if you will, needed to be opposed and that they're in the hands of the communists. And it makes what happens at Kent State and at the Democrat National Convention make more sense. And I'm not suggesting that one side is better than the other. I'm just suggesting that with context, the violence that ensues is explainable. And, you know, from the distance, especially if you're showing this to young people who had no context at that time, it's important to give them both sides so that they understand why there was such a strong conflict in the United States between the two sides. It wasn't just unblinkered support for the administration that was going on. There was a strong reaction to what Americans saw as people who did not love this country. It wasn't just that they opposed the war. It was that they were saying very un-American things and seemed to be aligning themselves with communist ideals. And people wanted to push back against that. So Doris and I saw Blade Runner 2049 this week. Doris, I'll let you go first. You watched the original Blade Runner the night before to refresh yourself and then saw this sequel. So what did you think?
Well, I thought it was an outstandingly gloomy film, but it had stunning visuals and really great special effects. I found that the film invites us to examine that when humans make androids or robots, will we make them so much like us that we become them? If you like sci-fi films, I would give this an A-, because at 2.5 hours, it's too long and they could easily have cut 30 minutes out. So if you're not a sci-fi film buff, I would give this a B-.
So Blade Runner has sort of achieved a cult following. It was not a success when it came out, and it has achieved kind of a loyal following. So what I would say is that there's only about 15 minutes worth of actual plot in this movie. And the original Blade Runner was very melodic. It had kind of a slow pace, and it was much more about setting a mood. It did have a story to tell, but it was also much more about setting a mood. The problem for the sequel is they don't really advance the story very much. There's just a slight addition made to the information that you already know from the original Blade Runner. So there isn't a tremendous amount of plot, but it does a fantastic job of reestablishing that mood and extending that out over 2 hours. So what I would say is if you have no real love for Blade Runner, you shouldn't see the movie because it's not that interesting then. For fans that did enjoy Blade Runner, I think what you're going to like is that it brings you right back into that whole world with the music and the pacing and the really beautiful visuals of a kind of dystopian world future. And if you enjoyed that in Blade Runner and you enjoy that when you watch Blade Runner, you're going to get re-immersed in that, and it's well worth your money to go and do that if you really like Blade Runner for that. I think you have to go in understanding that there just isn't going to be much advancement in the plot. It's just a little bit of information. It's enjoyable enough, but there's not much there. And so, again, as with most of my reviews, it depends on who you are and what you like. There's a lot of these sequels coming out, and many times I will say, if you're fans of this particular story or this original story, you're probably going to like what they're producing, but the film's not for people who are not already essentially in that club. So, again, if you've enjoyed Blade Runner, I think you'll enjoy the sequel. If you didn't think Blade Runner was a really great movie, I would probably tell you to pass on this. So we're just about out of time. You can find this show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Pocket Cast. This is a labor of love, but we need to grow, so I'm hoping that you will find one very good friend, and as your gift to them, introduce them to this podcast so that they can become loyal listeners just like you. Trump fans, you are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.